The Sovereign drifted dangerously close to an asteroid field, its once pristine hull now groaning under the pressure of malfunctioning engines. The shimmering lights of the distant stars flashed in the blackness of space, offering no comfort. Inside the command center, panic was palpable. Alarms screamed across every deck, and the vast display screens overhead blinked with red warnings. Propulsion failure. System overload. Collision imminent. Captain Selith, a tall, imposing figure with blue-tinted skin and silver eyes, paced frantically before the main console. The ship's usual hum was absent, replaced by the violent buzz of failing circuits. The Sovereign, an ancient flagship of the Tyrant Federation, was a symbol of their technological supremacy, a feat of engineering designed to withstand nearly any crisis. But today, it had failed. All around him, his crew struggled to interpret the cascade of error reports flashing across their stations. Report. Zilith barked. A younger officer, Quoth, turned to the captain with wide eyes. Sir, the primary propulsion system is offline. We've lost power to the core thrusters. The backup engines are malfunctioning as well. If we don't regain control soon, we're heading straight into the asteroid belt. Zilith clenched his fists, his mind racing. They had only moments before the Sovereign would be drawn into the field, its fragile hull shredded by the asteroids, its crew doomed. He turned sharply to the tactical officer. Initiate emergency course correction. Now. The officer's hands flew across the control panel, but the system failed to respond. The command sequence isn't processing, Captain, the officer said in disbelief. There's no response from the ship's autopilot. It's as if the entire network is shutting down. Impossible, Zelith muttered under his breath, the weight of the situation settling in. The Federation's technology had never failed like this before. Try manually rerouting power to the secondary engines. His crew scrambled, working furiously, but their efforts yielded no results. Systems that had been designed to keep the ship alive through the most hostile of environments were now mocking them, indifferent to the urgency of the moment. Zelith turned sharply, his mind racing for a solution. There was only one person left who might have a chance of helping them, though it was a last resort. Lieutenant Eric Lawson, the human engineer. A recent addition to the crew, Lawson was known for his unconventional approach to engineering, something that Axiron found unsettling. The Federation had long considered humans inferior to their advanced races. Their technology was crude, their designs inefficient by Axiron standards, and their ability to adapt to alien systems was questioned at every turn. Yet, in the short time Lawson had been aboard, he'd already proven to be an oddity. His hands often tinkering with anything that wasn't nailed down, his mind constantly probing new solutions where the Federation's engineers could only see dead ends. Call Lawson to the engineering bay. Now. Zilith's voice was sharp, but deep down, he felt a gnawing uncertainty. The human was their last hope, but how could someone so unrefined pull them out of this disaster? As the communications officer scrambled to make the call, Zilith turned his attention back to the view screen, where the asteroid field loomed closer with every passing second. The Sovereign was losing precious time. The thought of the ship being destroyed, along with hundreds of lives, settled heavily on his chest. He could only hope that Lawson's unorthodox methods would be enough to overcome the growing chaos. Seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. The countdown to disaster was moving too quickly. Time was running out. Lieutenant Eric Lawson didn't exactly look the part of a hero. Standing at just under 6 feet tall, with unruly brown hair and a slightly rumpled uniform, he had the demeanor of someone who had just rolled out of bed after a long shift. To the Tyrant crew, who were used to meticulous discipline and perfect order, his casual approach to life aboard the Sovereign was almost offensive. But beneath the slouched posture and seemingly unfocused gaze, there was a mind that had seen the unexpected and survived by thinking where others failed to. As Lawson entered the engineering bay, the room fell silent. Zithar, the senior alien officer overseeing the repair efforts, couldn't help but observe the human's disheveled appearance, his calm demeanor at odds with the chaos around them. Zithar had never fully understood the appeal of humans. Their engineering methods were primitive, and their habit of thinking outside the established parameters made their solutions feel like guessing rather than calculated risk. "What's the situation?" Lawson asked, his voice a touch hoarse but steady. He ignored the anxious glances of the alien crew, his gaze moving directly to the central console. Without hesitation, he approached the console, where flashing red symbols indicated a total systems failure. "Engine failure, as expected," Lawson muttered. "Don't worry. It's not the end of the world. Yet." Zithar didn't know what to make of the humans' apparent lack of panic. The ship was seconds from being torn apart by asteroids, and yet Lawson's calmness didn't just contrast the other officers' frantic energy. It seemed to mock it. Zithar took a step forward. "You've been briefed on the situation, Lieutenant Lawson." Lawson gave him a sidelong glance, the corners of his lips twitching upward slightly. "I've been briefed. I read the manual, something you might want to try doing, Zithar." His voice was dry, and Zithar felt his mouth tighten. The human didn't seem to recognize the subtle tension in the air, as though this were just another minor repair job. "Captain Zeleth has ordered a manual override," Zithar pressed, trying to refocus the situation. "We need to reroute the emergency power systems to engage a thrust, or we will not survive the asteroid field. Your method should be based on a standard Federation protocol." Lawson raised an eyebrow, his hands already working to open panels on the console. "Standard Federation protocols got us here, didn't they? Sometimes you need to do things a little differently." He tossed a glance over his shoulder at Zithar. "Look, I'm not going to sit here and debate whether your methods are better. I'm just going to get us out of this mess. And fast." Zithar's frustration spiked, but he knew there was no time to argue. Still, it irked him that this human was so willing to dismiss decades, centuries, of carefully honed Federation technology. Humans had no concept of the discipline and sophistication that had gone into creating systems like the Sovereigns. And yet, Lawson's confidence, though unwarranted in Zithar's eyes, seemed to be doing the impossible. The human was already deep in his work, his hands moving with practiced speed. He opened access panels with casual precision, muttering technical jargon under his breath as he connected wires and rerouted systems in a way that seemed absurd to Zithar. How could someone so unpolished understand the intricacies of the Federation systems better than their own engineers? "I've got a temporary bypass," Lawson announced, his voice unfazed by the mounting pressure. "This is going to be rough, but it'll work for long enough." Zithar stared at the human, his confusion growing. "You're improvising. This is not acceptable. You cannot." "You're right," Lawson cut him off. "I'm improvising because we're about to die if I don't. So unless you've got a better idea, I suggest you step back and let me finish." The audacity of it. Zithar's jaw clenched, but he could feel a ripple of unease in his gut. The other officers were watching Lawson now, some with a flicker of hope, others with sheer disbelief. Lawson didn't care for their stares, didn't care about Zithar's disapproval, nor did he seem fazed by the impending asteroid field. In that moment, Zithar understood. This wasn't about following protocol or using the best tools. It was about something else, something that humans seemed to possess in abundance, something unpredictable, raw, and stubborn, a desire to survive, a refusal to surrender. And as Lawson continued working, the officer realized that, for all his race's superior knowledge and tech, they were no match for this human's sheer will to solve the problem, no matter the odds. The hum of the Sovereign's failing systems was deafening. Sparks flew intermittently from the exposed wiring, and the steady whine of the ship's remaining power struggled to keep up with the demands of the emergency procedures. Zithar stood stiffly in the corner of the engineering bay. His eyes narrowed as he watched Lieutenant Lawson continue his work. "Is this really the best you can do?" Zithar muttered under his breath. He didn't expect a response, but Lawson's quick glance toward him spoke volumes. The human had no intention of acknowledging the alien's doubts. Lawson, unfazed by the pressure, began tapping into a secondary control panel with surprising ease. He was working fast, but it wasn't frantic. His movements were deliberate, calculated, yet with a certain relaxed confidence that Zithar found unsettling. He kept his mind focused on the simple, archaic tools he'd brought from his own engineering kit, tossing aside advanced Federation components as if they were inconsequential. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" Zithar couldn't stop himself from asking again, despite the ridiculousness of his question. Lawson didn't even pause. "Do you?" Zithar's brow furrowed at the question. His pride stung. The Federation had developed the finest engineering minds in the galaxy, yet here, in this moment of crisis, the humans seemed to suggest that their methods weren't enough. Worse, he was doing things that were entirely outside the realm of established protocol, tinkering with alien tech in ways that Zithar had been taught were impossible. Those circuits were never meant to be bypassed, Zithar said, his voice tightening. "They'll burn out. The ship will." "Overheat, yeah, I know," Lawson interrupted casually, barely acknowledging the concern in Zithar's voice. He connected a jury-rigged series of wires to an exposed junction, ignoring the now wavering readings from the core systems. "But if we don't do this, we're all dead anyway. I'm giving us enough time to fix the main power grid, while the bypass keeps us from falling apart." The alien officer stared at the human, his disbelief growing with each passing second. The Tyrant Federation prided itself on perfection, their technology, their protocols, their understanding of the universe. Everything had its place, its purpose. But here was a human, someone whose entire species had been considered primitive in comparison, making those rules feel irrelevant. Lawson wasn't just fixing a malfunction. He was bending the rules of the ship itself. The rest of the crew had gathered around the bay's entrance, watching Lawson in tense silence. The Axiran officers, initially hesitant, now found themselves watching the human with a mixture of awe and apprehension. How could something so chaotic, so unplanned, even work? But then, as Lawson manipulated the control panel, the ship's engines sputtered to life. Barely, but enough. The power systems that had failed earlier surged back to life, a temporary flicker of brilliance amidst the failing chaos. The vessel's trajectory began to stabilize. "See, told you," Lawson muttered, as though it were no more remarkable than tightening a bolt. "We're still here. Now we can actually fix this thing." He didn't celebrate. He didn't even look up at the crew. Instead, he continued his work, calm and steady. Zithar's mind raced. The human had bypassed several fail-safes designed to prevent anyone, even siren engineers, from touching the core systems. The Federation had always considered themselves the guardians of advanced technology, and humans, for all their resourcefulness, had been seen as less equipped to handle the complexities of such high-tech machinery. And yet, Lawson was doing just that. As the Sovereign steadied, Zithar's thoughts turned inward. He had heard the stories of human ingenuity, the way they could twist problems into solutions that no one had considered before. But this was something else entirely. No race, no civilization, not even the Axiran, had ever dared to think so far outside the box. Zithar looked at Lawson with a mixture of respect and wariness. Was this why humanity had risen to dominate their own world? Was it their reckless innovation, their refusal to follow established rules, that had made them dangerous to those who thought themselves superior? For the first time in a long while, Zithar wasn't sure what to make of the humans. What had once seemed like their greatest weakness, chaos, unpredictability, an unrefined approach, was proving to be their greatest strength. With one last, decisive turn of his wrench, Lawson's work was complete. The ship's systems hummed with renewed life. The engine, though not fully repaired, was at least functional. "We're not out of the woods yet," Lawson said without looking up, his voice cool. "We've got a fighting chance." Zithar stood in silence, his mind still reeling. He had witnessed the unexpected, the impossible, And somehow it had worked. The human had turned their crisis into something manageable. What had he just learned? And more importantly, why did he feel like they were only getting started? The Sovereign shuddered again, and the lights flickered, dimming for a moment before stabilizing. The hum of the ship's failing systems remained a constant companion, like a deep, uncomfortable growl. Outside, the asteroid field loomed, an impending doom that threatened to tear apart everything they had fought to preserve. The countdown clock ticked down relentlessly, each second becoming more precious than the last. Zithar clenched his jaw as he watched Lawson continue his work. Despite the mounting pressure, the human never seemed to break his rhythm. He had completed his first set of repairs with a nonchalance that had left Zithar and the rest of the crew unable to look away. They could hear the murmur of Lawson's muttered curses as he worked, his hands deftly moving between tools, rerouting systems, and adjusting alien components with what seemed to be little more than sheer instinct. The flicker of the Sovereign's failing systems, the near-complete loss of power. Zithar had seen similar situations before, but never one that had felt so entirely out of control. The idea that this human, this outsider, this stranger, could fix it was beyond comprehension. The Sovereign was Siren-built, Siren-designed. The technology was made by the greatest minds in the Federation, honed over millennia. Humans had no business knowing it, let alone understanding it. Zithar turned sharply, his hands folded behind his back. He could hear the subtle sounds of the alien engineers muttering nervously. Their instruments beeped in confusion, unable to interface with the ship's systems. Their Federation training was useless here. "Sir, the power grid is failing again," reported the tactical officer, her voice shaky. "The damage is too widespread. We're running out of time." Lawson didn't seem to hear her. He was deep in the bowels of the ship now, sweat glistening on his brow as he crouched beneath a panel, removing yet another component, his fingers working with precision. His entire body was tense, focused. "Lieutenant Lawson," Zithar called, walking towards the engineer, "this is not a simple repair. What you are doing is beyond the scope of human understanding. You are putting the entire ship at risk. You must stop and let us handle it. We are trained for this." Lawson didn't look up. He didn't pause. "You were trained to follow orders," Lawson said, his voice low but steady. "I'm trying to save your ship." Zithar's eyes narrowed, irritation rising. The human was dismissive, refusing to acknowledge the expertise of his crew. And yet, the alien officer had to admit, what Lawson had done so far had worked. The ship was still in one piece, and they were not yet careening into the asteroid field. But Zithar's pride still chafed at the notion. They had advanced technology, systems that no other species could understand. How was it possible that a human, with their crude tools and lack of proper training, had been able to keep the Sovereign from destruction? "What are you doing now?" Zithar asked, trying to steady his voice. Lawson stood up from beneath the panel, his hands covered in grease and a few sparks still crackling from the junction he had just repaired. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand, his expression unchanged. "The auxiliary power core is fused with the main systems. If I can reroute the energy through this bypass, we should have just enough to get the main engines running, long enough for the captain to take control of the helm." Zithar blinked, considering the human's explanation. Reroute the energy. That wasn't possible. The Federation's safety protocols wouldn't allow such a maneuver. Not without catastrophic consequences. "You're suggesting we use unstable power to fuel the engines. That is insane. You'll destroy the core." Lawson chuckled, a low, dry sound. "Listen, I didn't get into this line of work by playing it safe. Sometimes you have to bend the rules to survive. Don't worry. It's not pretty, but it'll work." Zithar shook his head. He couldn't shake the growing sense that the human was onto something. Despite the impossibility of it all, there was a part of him that knew Lawson was right, that Siren engineers were trapped in their rigid understanding of how technology should work. Lawson had discarded that thinking, pushing past it. The alien officer's frustration mingled with awe. The Sovereign groaned once more, a massive thud echoing from the engine room. The asteroid field was now only moments away. Zithar glanced at the tactical display. The ship was on a direct collision course with a massive rock that could easily tear through the Sovereign's fragile hull. Lawson glanced up, his face suddenly more serious. "Ready?" he asked, as if the weight of the situation had finally reached him. His hands hovered over the final series of connections. Zithar didn't respond immediately. The reality of the situation pressed down on him. The Sovereign, the pride of the Federation, was on the verge of destruction. They had no more time to waste. Finally, Zithar spoke, his voice quieter than before. "Do it." Without another word, Lawson completed the final connection. The Sovereign shuddered, then gave a sudden, violent jolt. For a moment, it felt like the ship might break apart. But then the alarms fell silent. The engine room hummed to life again, a low, steady rumble reverberating through the walls. The ship had a pulse once more. Zithar's heart hammered in his chest as the screen flickered back to life. They had just narrowly avoided total destruction. The asteroid field was still ahead, but they had bought themselves time. Time to act. Lawson wiped his hands off and straightened, nodding once. That's how it's done. Zithar couldn't argue. The human had done what no one else could. He had bent the very systems of the Sovereign to his will, in a way that defied logic, that no Terran could have predicted. And the worst part, Zithar wasn't sure if he could have done it himself. The Sovereign drifted in the endless void of space, its damaged systems barely holding together. The ship's once pristine hull bore the marks of the desperate struggle to survive. Scratches and scorched metal from the earlier electrical surges, exposed wiring snaking through the walls, and the faint scent of burnt circuits lingering in the air. Yet, despite all the damage, it was still here. And that, in itself, was a victory. But Lawson knew they weren't out of danger yet. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands still shaking slightly from the sheer intensity of the repairs. He leaned against the console, catching his breath, as the rest of the crew tried to process what had just happened. Zithar stood nearby, arms crossed, watching him with that same inscrutable expression, his silver eyes flicking between the screens. "Lieutenant Lawson." Zithar finally spoke, his voice steady but tinged with a new respect. "You've saved us for now. But there are still complications ahead. The asteroid field. It's getting closer." Lawson's gaze flickered to the view screen, where massive asteroids, some the size of small moons, tumbled through space, ready to smash anything in their path. The field was dense, unpredictable, and vast. Even with the engines back online, navigating through it would be a challenge. The Sovereign's trajectory was now a wild gamble. "We're still not out of the woods," Lawson admitted, his voice unusually calm. He wasn't one to sugarcoat things, not when every second counted. "But it's a hell of a lot better than it was 5 minutes ago." Zithar didn't respond immediately. He was still processing the idea that the human's improvisation had worked. Again. As much as the alien officer loathed to admit it, Lawson was the only one who had been able to make any real progress in fixing the ship. "We need to calculate a safe route through the field," Zithar said, his mind already switching back into tactical mode. "We have only one chance to make it through without total destruction." Lawson grunted. "You're preaching to the core. But navigating this thing is going to take more than just your average Federation tech. The Sovereign's core is unstable, and we're running on a jury-rigged power system. If we push too hard, we could burn out again. If we don't push enough, we'll never make it through the field." Zithar's eyes narrowed. "Then what do you suggest?" Lawson stepped forward, pointing to a tactical display on the wall. The display showed the asteroid field's dense outer edge, where large rocks tumbled with incredible speed. But what Lawson saw wasn't just chaos. He saw patterns, a human trait, one Zithar had never fully understood. The ability to recognize order and disorder, to find rhythm in a storm. "I've been watching the asteroid trajectories," Lawson said, his finger moving to highlight certain areas of the field. There are pockets of space in between the larger rocks. We can navigate through those gaps, but only if we throttle the engines just right. Too fast, and we'll crash into something. Too slow, and we'll be sitting ducks. Zithar looked at the display. The gaps Lawson pointed to were small, narrow corridors between asteroids where their size and speed meant the ship could, in theory, pass through without being hit. It was a near impossible maneuver, but it was the only viable option. The asteroid field was too dense to just blindly speed through. Lawson took a deep breath, his gaze now focused on the view screen again. We need to engage the auxiliary systems now, but at a low intensity. It'll allow us to drift through the gaps, while keeping the Sovereign just enough in motion to avoid collision. We have to trust the calculations. We can't afford to overthink this. The sound of Zithar's teeth grinding was barely audible. Every fiber of his being screamed against trusting a human's instinct over the cold precision of Federation logic. But the human's eyes, focused, determined, told him something. He had already gotten them this far, after all. There was no going back. "Proceed," Zithar said reluctantly, his voice tight with the admission of just how much was riding on Lawson's decisions. "You have command of the course through the field. We follow your lead." Lawson didn't need to be told twice. He moved quickly, issuing orders to the crew to engage the auxiliary engines and ready the navigation systems. As his hands flew over the console, Lawson's mind raced with the complexity of the calculations. There was no room for error. One misstep, one wrong calculation, and the Sovereign would be torn to pieces. The tension in the air was palpable. Every officer aboard the Sovereign had their eyes fixed on the screens. Some were still unconvinced that a human could outthink their superior technology, but Lawson was proving them wrong at every turn. Zithar stood at the back of the room, silent, observing the human who had become both their greatest asset and their most unpredictable force. The ship began to move, inching forward through the asteroid field. It was a slow, tense crawl. Lawson's hands were steady, his eyes darting back and forth across the tactical display, calculating their every move. The Sovereign slipped into the first gap, barely wide enough to fit, but it passed through unharmed. The crew let out a collective breath. "Keep going," Lawson muttered. His voice was a low murmur, but it carried with it the weight of 1,000 decisions being made in the span of seconds. As the ship edged closer to the next gap, Lawson's grip tightened. He didn't trust the calm he felt. There was no such thing as safety, not in the void of space, and certainly not in a malfunctioning ship drifting through an asteroid field. The stakes had never been higher. The asteroid field pressed in around them like a suffocating vice, its jagged edges looming on all sides. The Sovereign crept through the narrow gaps Lawson had identified, inching forward with slow, deliberate precision. Every second felt like a lifetime. The engines hummed beneath their feet, a low, steady pulse that seemed to synchronize with their heartbeats. The sound of the ship's hull groaning under pressure was a constant reminder of how fragile their situation was. Lawson's hands danced over the controls, adjusting the auxiliary power to maintain the delicate balance between speed and control. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he concentrated, his eyes locked on the readouts. Zithar stood to the side, arms folded tightly across his chest, watching every move the human made. For all his training, Zithar couldn't ignore the rising knot in his stomach. If this human failed, they all failed. The gap ahead narrowed, the asteroid looming larger by the second. Lawson's breath was shallow as he made the necessary adjustments, but Zithar could see the flicker of hesitation in the human's eyes. This was the moment, the one where a misstep could send them plummeting into the heart of the field, where collision with a rock the size of a small city could obliterate the Sovereign in an instant. The Sovereign passed through the gap, just barely. A shudder ran through the ship as the hull scraped against a jagged edge of rock, but they were through. Zithar's breath caught in his chest as the ship stabilized. "Nice work," Lawson muttered, his voice calm but laced with the faintest edge of strain. Zithar didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was still processing what had just happened. The human had done it again. His unorthodox approach had brought them through a deadly obstacle. But Zithar's sense of unease only grew. He didn't know how much longer this fragile system could hold. "Report," Lawson said, turning to the crew. "What's our status?" The tactical officer, still wide-eyed, quickly scanned her instruments. "We've made it through the first section of the field, Lieutenant. The path ahead looks clearer, but we've lost power to some of the secondary systems. The energy reserves are unstable." Lawson cursed under his breath. "We need to keep pushing forward. We're almost there." Zithar stepped forward, his voice cold. "If we push too far, we'll exhaust the core. The backup systems won't hold." "I know," Lawson replied, his tone flat, the stress evident in his eyes. "But we don't have a choice. We can't afford to stop now. If we don't get through the rest of the field, we're not making it out of here." The tension in the room was palpable as the crew exchanged nervous glances. The reality of their situation was beginning to sink in. No matter how they approached it, they were on the verge of disaster. Zithar could feel the weight of the decision on his shoulders. This was it. They had either trusted the humans' instincts too far, or they were about to witness a miracle. The ship trembled again, this time with more force, sending a shockwave through the corridor. Sparks flew from a nearby console, and the lights flickered, dimming for a fraction of a second before returning to full strength. The core was failing, and they all knew it. "Captain, we're losing stabilizers in the aft section," the engineer called out from across the room. "Power is fluctuating. We're on the edge of a full meltdown." "Can we fix it?" Lawson asked immediately, his voice urgent. The engineer shook his head. "Not with what we've got left." Zithar's heart pounded in his chest. "This ship is collapsing around us. If we don't act fast." "I know," Lawson snapped. "I'm trying, but we're out of time. We need to reroute the auxiliary power to the stabilizers and engage the forward thrusters. If we don't, we'll be pulled into the heart of the field. At least with the forward thrusters, we can maneuver to a safer spot." Zithar hesitated, still unsure of the humans' ability to pull this off. But there was no time for doubt. If they didn't act now, the ship would tear apart. "Do it," Zithar commanded, his voice tight. The alien officer's pride was now fully entwined with the survival of the crew. And perhaps just this once, the human had proven himself. Lawson moved with precision, his hands flying over the controls. The air around them grew thick with tension, the sound of his rapid commands filling the room. The Sovereign shuddered again, and for a terrifying moment, Zithar thought they were done for. But then, Lawson's voice cut through the chaos, steady and sure. "We've got one shot at this," he muttered to no one in particular, his eyes focused entirely on the readouts. "Get ready." With a flick of a switch, the Sovereign surged forward, its thrusters firing just enough to push the ship forward into the clear. The asteroid field's gravity was relentless, but with the auxiliary systems redirecting power and the forward thrusters engaged, the ship moved with a newfound urgency, slicing through the gaps with a precision Zithar hadn't thought possible. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, it felt like the entire ship would tear apart, but the Sovereign held steady. The ship jolted one final time. And then, nothing. Silence. Lawson slumped against the console, his breath ragged, sweat dripping down his face. He had done it. Against all odds, he had gotten them through the worst of the field. Zithar stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing, before his gaze flickered to Lawson. The human's face was pale, his body trembling with exhaustion. But there was a glint in his eyes, something that told Zithar they weren't done yet. The Sovereign had survived. For now, the Sovereign finally broke free from the dense asteroid field, the immediate threat of collision averted. The ship glided through the remnants of the field, now on a steady course, though every member of the crew was keenly aware of how close they had come to disaster. The air was thick with the buzz of malfunctioning systems and the odd hiss of displaced pressure vents, but there was a strange quiet now, a lull in the chaos. Lawson stood at the central console, his hand still on the controls, though his fingers moved with less urgency. The screens in front of him flickered but remained mostly stable. The Sovereign was damaged, no doubt about that, but it had survived, and that for now was enough. He allowed himself a brief moment to breathe, leaning back in his chair and wiping the sweat from his brow. But the quiet didn't last long. A soft beeping broke the silence. "Lieutenant Lawson," Zithar's voice echoed across the bridge. The alien officer was standing across the room, his silver eyes fixed on the tactical display. "There's a new signal. We're receiving an unknown transmission." Lawson's brow furrowed. A transmission. They had just barely escaped the asteroid field and were still in the aftermath of their narrow survival. The last thing they needed was more complications. "Show me," Lawson muttered, already turning back to the console. A signal appeared on the screen, a faint, pulsing message. It wasn't Federation. It wasn't Chiron. It was something else, something unfamiliar. The transmission wasn't hostile, but there was a distinct lack of any recognizable identification. A warning, perhaps, or an invitation. Either way, it sent a chill down Lawson's spine. "Can you trace it?" Lawson asked, his voice low, more cautious than he cared to admit. Zithar's lips pressed into a thin line. "We've attempted. It's masked by interference. Whoever sent it is using advanced scrambling techniques. We can't get a lock." Lawson stood, pacing in front of the console. "Any ideas who might be behind this?" "There are many factions in this sector who don't adhere to Federation protocols," Zithar said with a grim look. "The signal is coming from beyond the fringes of known space, far from any known colonies or patrol routes. This could be a pirate transmission, or something worse." Lawson could feel the weight of Zithar's words. The sector beyond Federation space was notorious for being a wild frontier. No clear laws, no clear alliances, and with the Sovereign limping along like it was, they were in no condition to engage with any hostile force. "Can we block it out?" Lawson asked, knowing it was a long shot. Zithar shook his head. "The interference is too strong. If we cut the signal entirely, we risk missing something critical. We may be able to isolate it, but the process is delicate." There was a long pause. Lawson exhaled, tension creeping back into his shoulders. This wasn't what he'd signed up for. He was an engineer, not a diplomat or a fighter. He had fixed a failing ship, not expected to handle hostile transmissions from unknown enemies. But the situation wasn't about to wait for him to feel comfortable. He turned to Zithar. "I'll get to work on the systems. We're not going to just sit here and wait for whoever's behind this to find us." Zithar nodded, but didn't look entirely convinced. "Very well. But we must proceed cautiously. We can't afford to attract more attention." The hum of the ship's failing systems filled the room once more as Lawson worked, plugging into the comm system and rerouting resources to trace the signal. His fingers moved quickly, bypassing what he could and attempting to stabilize the transmission long enough to get some form of communication. His mind raced, weighing the possibilities. Was this a warning? Or were they walking straight into a trap? Minutes passed. The ship's consoles blinked sporadically, and the ship's artificial gravity seemed to waver for a brief second, a reminder of how precariously they were managing. Lawson pushed it all aside, focusing entirely on the task at hand. Suddenly, the signal cleared. A cold, mechanical voice reverberated through the bridge. "You have entered restricted territory. Leave immediately, or we will be forced to take action." The voice wasn't Federation. It wasn't even remotely familiar to Lawson. But it carried an unmistakable edge of authority, enough to send a ripple of unease through his chest. Zithar stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "We are not in Federation space," he muttered, eyes flicking to the tactical readouts. "This is not a warning we can ignore." Lawson exhaled slowly, Feeling the weight of the situation bear down on him once more, we need to decide what our next move is. If we're dealing with an unknown force, we can't afford to make a mistake. We're not equipped to handle conflict right now, Zithar said grimly. Not with the state the ship is in. But we can't leave either. The signal was clear. We are being watched. We're too far from the nearest Federation outpost to be rescued quickly. Lawson's mind churned as he considered their options. A hostile force, isolated in an unfamiliar sector. A damaged ship. There were no good choices here. And yet, despite the uncertainty, he felt the flicker of determination. Survival. It wasn't just about escaping danger. It was about finding a way through, no matter the odds. Set a course for the nearest colony, Lawson said, his voice firm. We'll find shelter there, but we're going to have to be ready for whatever's coming. Zithar met his gaze, then nodded slowly, clearly still unsure of the human's resolve. But in that moment, he knew there was no going back. The calm before the storm had passed. Now they had to face what came next. The Sovereign drifted silently through the void, its damaged systems barely holding together. The warning from the mysterious transmission still lingered in the air, a weight that hung heavily over the crew. The calm that had settled over them after their narrow escape from the asteroid field felt like a fragile illusion, shattered by the unblinking stare of an unknown enemy. Lawson stood at the center of the bridge, his eyes fixed on the flashing consoles before him. The crew had fallen silent. No one dared to speak, not with the growing sense of danger that seemed to tighten around them with every passing second. Zithar, still as stoic as ever, stood beside him, watching the sane readouts, his face unreadable. Do we engage? Lawson's voice broke the silence, low but determined. He wasn't asking Zithar to make the decision. He was preparing himself. He'd seen the alien officer's hesitation, the same doubt that had plagued him earlier in the asteroid field. We don't have much of a choice, Zithar replied, his voice tight with the weight of the situation. The signal is clear. If they wanted us to leave, they would have given us a way out. We're not going to escape just by running. We need to know who we're dealing with. Lawson nodded. The Sovereign's course was now set for the nearest colony, but he knew it wouldn't be enough to simply reach shelter. They were being watched. Whether it was pirates, hostile factions, or something even worse, they were no longer in control. The human instinct to survive kicked in, pushing him toward action. They couldn't wait for the threat to come to them. We'll keep our course steady for now, Lawson said, his voice gaining strength. But we need to be ready for anything. Engage the defensive systems and prepare the crew for whatever's next. Agreed, Zithar said, turning toward the tactical officer. Alert the crew to be on high alert. We'll need every advantage we can get. The tension on the bridge was palpable as the crew moved into action, double-checking systems and making final preparations for whatever might be coming. Lawson returned his attention to the console, rerouting power to the communication systems. The unknown transmission had already left them with more questions than answers, but one thing was certain. They couldn't remain passive. Moments later, the voice returned, this time more insistent, its metallic edge cutting through the silence like a knife. You are trespassing. Leave now, or we will take immediate action. Lawson's fingers tightened on the console, a flicker of unease running through him. He had heard that tone before, cold, calculating, the voice of someone who expected compliance without question. He glanced over at Zithar. We're too close to a colony, Lawson muttered, his mind racing. If we engage now, we could risk drawing attention from the Federation, or worse. If they're hostile, we'll have to fight. Then we fight, Zithar said flatly. We can't afford to cower. Not now. The Federation will deal with the aftermath. But we must act. Lawson's eyes flicked to the tactical display. The transmission was coming from a location just beyond the colony's defensive perimeter. The unknown enemy had made it clear they had the upper hand. As he weighed their options, the bridge suddenly jolted, sending a shudder through the Sovereign. Warning lights flashed on the console, and the ship's hull groaned under the stress. A new signal appeared on the radar. Something big was coming. Contact. The tactical officer shouted. Massive vessel inbound, bearing 132 Mark 47. Lawson didn't hesitate. All hands, brace for impact. Raise shields and engage evasive maneuvers. The Sovereign lurched again as the engines roared to life, pushing them forward at full thrust. Lawson's hands flew over the controls, trying to maintain stability as the ship raced toward the colony. The distant glow of the colony's defense stations flickered in the distance, a faint glimmer of hope. But the incoming vessel was faster. On the view screen, the silhouette of the massive enemy ship became clearer, an imposing behemoth of black metal, its design sleek but menacing, equipped with an array of weapons that shimmered ominously. They were outgunned, outmanned, and running out of time. The first blast hit them without warning, slamming into the shields with a deafening crack. Sparks flew from the consoles, and the ship shuddered violently. Lawson gritted his teeth, hands gripping the controls as he fought to keep the Sovereign steady. Shields holding at 35%. The engineer reported, her voice trembling. Hull integrity compromised. Reinforced sections are holding, but we can't take much more of this. Keep pushing forward, Lawson shouted. We need to reach the colony's defenses. If we can make it to their perimeter, we can get reinforcements. But the enemy wasn't giving them any room to maneuver. The enemy vessel fired again, this time aimed directly at the engines. Another explosion rocked the Sovereign, sending the ship into a wild spin. Lawson fought against the controls, desperately trying to regain stability. The lights flickered, and the entire bridge seemed to tremble as if the Sovereign itself was about to collapse. We're not going to make it, the tactical officer said, her voice strained. They're closing in. There's no escape. Lawson's heart pounded. The odds were stacked against them, but the fire inside him wasn't out yet. He had come too far to give up now. His mind flashed back to the asteroid field, to the impossible choices they had faced, and how he had solved them, through instinct, skill, and sheer will. There had to be a way through this. There had to be. Prepare for one last shot, Lawson said through clenched teeth. We're going to give it everything we've got. He slammed his fist into the console, triggering the final systems. The ship groaned again, but this time, it surged forward, engines roaring as the Sovereign darted toward the enemy vessel, heading straight for the colony's defense perimeter. For a split second, the world seemed to slow. The Sovereign was battered, the crew exhausted, but Lawson knew one thing for certain. They weren't done yet.